There are three major strands of political thought that emerged and did battle in the 20th century in order to determine which of them was going to steer the West into the future. And these were liberalism, communism, and fascism. And historically, the form that battle took was World War II, and that determined that fascism was going to be crushed out, right? It was no longer going to be in the picture. And now sort of the political dialectic that forms in the Cold War is between liberalism and communism. And we've already covered those two on the podcast. We've talked about Nietzsche contra capitalism and Nietzsche contra socialism. Of those three, fascism is simultaneously, therefore, sort of the most important, but also the least important of Nietzsche's philosophy to address. And what I mean by this is that on the one hand, fascism is irrelevant, but on the other, it's perhaps more pressing than ever for us to produce a Nietzschean critique of it. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment here, but that's what we're going to do today. Today we cover the third of those three major ideologies. The reason why I say that it's now irrelevant is because it's been stamped out of the West. It doesn't figure into the Overton window of acceptable conversation. Now in the post-Cold War world, very often our political disagreements end up framed in terms of liberalism versus socialism, or libertarianism versus socialism, as we might say in America. And that's sort of how this very complex dialectic has been boiled down into these giant frescoes of stupidity, Nietzsche would say, of do you want freedom or do you want equality? Do you want self-determination or do you want well-being, right? Do you want economic choice or economic security? That's normally how we boil down these issues. But the very fact that the internal logic of both socialism and liberalism sort of now forms up the dialectic in the West, I think points to the fact that these were like the winning ideologies, at least in respect to fascism, which was crushed and relegated to the fringe of society. And now, outside of some internet edgelords and tiny minorities of disaffected right-wingers or delusional cosplayers, right, fascism is gone. They lost. And so addressing it with criticism doesn't really even seem worth it on some level. While a Nietzschean critique against capitalism or socialism might make some who advocate for these ideas think critically about them, not only are fascists unlikely to do this, but it seems to me almost like unnecessarily dignifying something with a response that isn't even really warranted. It's like arguing against Christianity from the Nietzschean perspective, right? You know, Christianity is dead, and continuing to beat the corpse is more informative about you than it is about the Christians, right? It's also often the case the most ardent anti-Christians tend to still harbor very Christian sentiments, right? Which may account for their hostility to it. And so in the same sense, we might say that many people today who are still obsessed with fighting fascism oftentimes themselves hold very authoritarian beliefs. Fascism is always invoked as the boogeyman of either side of the political aisle here in America. But oftentimes the people invoking it have just as authoritarian of goals in mind, right? So that being said, fascism might still be justifiably the most important ideology to address out of those three major strands of political thought. It's the most important one to challenge, I should say. And that's in part because Nietzsche has always been tarred with the accusation that his ideas influenced them, that the fascists of the 20th century took from Nietzsche's ideas. And in fact, Nietzsche was not only called a proto-fascist by his critics, but he was even appropriated by some fascist thinkers. And so, to me, that makes the issue somewhat pressing to address, because Nietzsche does seem to point to something, some horizon of, what would you say, morality or of a political order or a new type of feeling or some new type of sentimentality, something that's beyond the modern world, right? And there's many parallels with the fascists in this respect that might lead some to mistake Nietzsche for one of them and think that fascism is the path that will lead them off into the future, when in actual truth, as I think I'll show today, such thinking remains firmly outside of Nietzsche and firmly within the paradigm of the modern world. Because fascism, in fact, has much more in common with liberal democracy and with socialism than anything having to do with Nietzsche's ideas. It depends on mass energy. Under fascism, like with many modern forms of government, the state becomes this monstrous thing. It invests its institutions with control over its citizens that would have been unthinkable in past ages. And the state becomes the be-all, end-all of the whole movement. And furthermore, as Nietzsche points out, the values and the sensibilities and the pathologies that find expression in this fascist state are those of the most average person in society. Fascism appeals, as Umberto Eco argues in his Fascism essay, to the middle classes, to the people who feel most precarious, who feel humiliated and threatened by pressure from the lower classes. And as Eco goes on to argue, it thrives, above all, on feelings of national identity, which imparts an identity to the person who otherwise has none, nothing distinguishing or special about him which he may celebrate or take pride in. Fascism therefore addresses this by allowing him to celebrate his greatness as part of a nation or an ethnicity. And so in the politics of fascism, even though certain elements are turned up to the extreme, we see all the aspects which make it unmistakably the product of modernity and a product of modern politics, which is to say democratic energy, the expansion of the state into a massive authoritarian bureaucracy, and that sort of dialectic within fascism between drawing on the class warfare of the socialists because they have a material basis in the middle classes, but also nationalism, this idea of like class collaborationism. But all of these concepts, right, class consciousness and nationalism, things of that nature, these come out of the modern political world. Now, if you've listened to the show up to this point, you'll know that Nietzsche had nothing but disdain for the proto-Nazis and the anti-Semites in Germany during this time. And he has a distrust of the state, which we've discussed in this critique of socialism that we did last week. That will also be relevant here. And finally, when we look at that element of harnessing mass energy in order to bring about sweeping changes in society, you can imagine what Nietzsche would think of that, as well as the self-identification with the nationality or with one's ethnicity as a means of subsuming one's individuality within, a party or within one's race. These are things that Nietzsche argued against. And yet that accusation has always stuck. And so, even though I've addressed this throughout the show, since we're finally doing a whole season on politics and I've done whole episodes on capitalism and socialism, we're finally going to look at all of the relevant information on fascism and let Nietzsche's own words show his opposition to these ideas. Whether they emerge in the form of like Mussolinian state worship or the Hitlerian like racial authoritarianism. His philosophy rejects fascism as a romantic delusion. It's an attempt to make the small people feel as though they're more important than they are by appeals to their racial superiority or by calling them servants of this all-powerful state, right? And then they can self-identify with the state and feel as though they're powerful through it. And as with the critique that we talked about in the episode on socialism, all of the value that's being invested into the state will eventually lead to the state becoming an ends instead of a means, and that's one of the greatest dangers of modern life, I think, that Nietzsche thinks we're perhaps inevitably moving toward. The relation between Nietzsche and these proto-fascists that arose in Germany, it's one of those topics that sits at the intersection of Nietzsche's life and his philosophy. We can't really talk about Nietzsche's opinion on fascism without talking about these figures in his life who were tied into creating that movement in Germany. So, for example, Nietzsche's very sister, Elisabeth, and the man she married, Bernhard Foster, as well as Nietzsche's personal hero and his friend Richard Wagner. His ideas would later be very influential in the Nazi movement. So what we find is very instructive in Nietzsche's close relationships here is that in the case of both Wagner and Elisabeth, it's their political direction that Nietzsche cites as a driving factor in his break with them. After Wagner descends into German nationalism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, Nietzsche breaks with him, and he writes extensively about this in the case of Wagner, and more or less everything Nietzsche had written about Wagner he compiled into Nietzsche Contra Wagner. And between these two works, Nietzsche makes it rather clear for us that there were three big reasons why he broke away from Wagner. And that was that he adopted German Lutheranism as part of his identity, he adopted anti-Semitism, and German nationalism. Basically, everything the Nazis liked about Wagner was what Nietzsche grew to hate about him. Elisabeth Nietzsche, his only living sibling, he actually had a fairly close relationship with Elisabeth growing up. But her marriage to this man, Bernard Foster, who was a notorious anti-Semite, is one of the things that leads Nietzsche to become estranged from her. And while they would later return to speaking terms, their relationship was never quite the same after that. As with Richard Wagner, there were other reasons for their estrangement apart from Elisabeth's political beliefs. She also tried to involve herself in Nietzsche's friendship with Lou Salome, for example. But nevertheless, it's in letters such as this one that Nietzsche makes his feelings unmistakably clear to his sister. Quote, "One of the greatest stupidities you have committed, for yourself and for me, your association with an anti-Semitic chief expresses a foreignness to my whole way of life, which fills me ever again with ire or melancholy." End quote. Her association with an anti-Semitic chief, Bernard Foster, by calling him a chief, what Nietzsche means by that is that Foster famously or infamously attempted to begin a commune for like-minded Germans on the other side of the Atlantic over in Paraguay. It was called the New Germany Colony, and Elisabeth would eventually join him there. And considering that many of the Nazis would later flee to South America after World War II, I guess we could say that Foster was ahead of his time. But in any case, Foster wrote down some of his unusual ideas about like race and religion. And one thing that I think will interest us in this discussion is Foster's interpretation of Jesus Christ, because in many respects, as we will discuss in a bit, Nietzsche's view of Jesus is like a direct rebuke to Foster's view, right? Foster tried to argue that Jesus was not really Jewish, but a Teutonic Aryan who was martyred by the Jews. And so Foster represents this sort of weird trend in German thinking at the time where they had an equal regard for Teutonic paganism, the old religion of Thor and Wotan, as they did have a regard for German Lutheran Christianity, right? The sort of the Christianity of the common rural German person. And so Foster was torn between these two religions much as Wagner was, and much as the Nazis would somewhat be. Now, upon Elisabeth's engagement to Foster, Nietzsche wrote to her in another letter, quote, "You have gone over to my antipodes. I will not conceal that I consider this engagement an insult or a stupidity which will harm you as much as me." End quote. So his considers those with these anti-Semitic theories about race and the Christian religion and all of that to be antipodal to everything that he is, right? Now, as regards Wagner, the situation's a little more complicated. I recommend, if you're unfamiliar with the whole background of that, I did a 2-part episode on it last season that you can check out. But the long and short of it is that for reasons both personal and political, the two more or less stopped communicating shortly after the time of Human All Too Human's publication. Nietzsche writes, quote, "I said farewell to Wagner in my heart. Since Wagner moved to Germany, he had condescended step by step to everything I despise, even to anti-Semitism." End quote. The move to Germany that Nietzsche mentions is Wagner relocating from his more secluded villa in Triebschen, which is on the Lake Lucerne in Switzerland, where Nietzsche spent sort of his best years hanging out with the Wagners in between his time teaching classes at Basel. Wagner moves from there to Bayreuth, which was the site of Wagner's new annual festival, and he had sort of planned Bayreuth to be the intended center of Wagnerianism in Germany. And so once Wagner had left the Alps and descended to be among his followers and worshippers, he becomes captured by them. And sort of, it's what they call audience capture, right? He's captured by the thoughts and feelings and pathologies of his own audience, which is a well-known phenomenon. And it's sort of Nietzsche's diagnosis of one of the things that happens to Wagner, that he becomes so in tune with playing on the emotions of his audience and their sentimentality that he becomes one with them. The crowd overtakes him, and he becomes the voice, the expression of their hopes and their dreams, and yes, all their fears and hatreds, right? And the most despicable among those fears and hatreds is Wagner's anti-Semitism that's nourished or nurtured, on the crowd. And so I want to begin with talking about this aspect. Even though anti-Semitism isn't by any means a sine qua non of fascism, because we could easily imagine fascism arising in a place where anti-Semitism isn't an issue or where the Jews aren't even around in any significant population, right? And yet there's always this essential factor of fascism, that it always posits this nefarious plot to threaten the welfare of the people from these like cabal of conspirators, and it's perpetrated by groups that are both internal and internationals. And for the Nazis, the people that they would single out were the Jews. And since the Nazis were the ones who tried to appropriate Nietzsche, not only can we show how he is fundamentally against them on this specific aspect, but he sees underneath anti-Semitism that deeper tendency within all fascist movements, and he actually criticizes it on a more fundamental level. Some have called that phenomenon scapegoating, but I don't think that quite encapsulates the idea, because it's not the notion that we have to sacrifice this guilty or weak element of our society in order to be cleansed of sin. It's quite another notion. It's that this element of society, however successful or downtrodden they may appear to be, actually secretly runs society, and is the reason why you, the common person, can't succeed in life. Right? It's why your whole way of life seems threatened. And so the Jewish people are not exactly a quote-unquote scapegoat, a sacrifice on which to vent your own sins. I think that's sort of a misnomer that we use that term. The Nazis perceived them as this powerful conspiracy that was meant to attack all of European society. Now, their thought is somewhat contradictory on this, because the enemy must also be seen as defeatable. So simultaneously, as they're all-powerful, they also, they seem incredibly strong and incredibly weak at the same time, right? So Umberto Eco has also pointed this out, and it led to the fascists as always unable to accurately assess the strength of their enemies. It's why Eco thinks that fascism tends to always lose, because they simply cannot honestly look at what the force of the enemy actually is, right? They can't see it for what it really is. But I think the central point here is that the need for an enemy is this psychological manifestation of the need to create an external source for all of one's problems, the need to project our insecurities into a figure. And that's how stereotyping works. You reduce all of the group down to a single figure. And notice that we all know the imagery associated with anti-Semitic propaganda. All of the Jews become the stereotypical image of the Jew in the mind of the anti-Semite, right? So anti-Semitism, I think it's a good example of, it's represents that archetypal form of fascistic hatred, because it provides the fascist with an enemy that's both internal and international, and it's contained in one figure, and it's seen as both beneath you and subhuman and undeserving of any wealth or power, and yet they're also somehow also in charge of every institution and every university and so on and so forth. And so you conjure up this figure to represent all the insecurities and pathologies of the average person within society, and you stir up the popular energy to a frenzy by continuing to sort of narrate and perpetuate a sense of war between this average salt of the earth person, the blood and soil person, right, as the Nazis said, and this evil figure who's conspired to enslave them through guile and trickery, right? So for why Nietzsche disdained anti-Semitism, I think I should point out on some level, we don't really need to make things complicated here. I mean, Nietzsche is simply intelligent enough to recognize that judging entire groups of people based on this caricature or stereotyping is not only incorrect, but it's driven by this underlying psychological need of the people who are doing the stereotyping. That the centuries of hatred against the Jews in Europe comes out of that insecurity, out of that self-hatred of people who saw individual Jewish families and individuals as more industrious and more conscientious and thus more successful. And meanwhile, Jewish intellectuals and scientists and philosophers, they're always sort of prominent across Europe. And so the hatred of the Jews can therefore be understood as something born of envy and of resentment. And so that's why Nietzsche thinks of anti-Semitism as against his entire way of life, because he not only does he think that we have to make ourselves free of envy and resentment, but he also tends to admire the outstanding individuals within civilization and set himself against what is average. And so we find that in the long list of influences on Nietzsche's thought, that Baruch Spinoza, a Sephardian Jew, makes a huge impact, right? Nietzsche calls him his precursor, and he asks, quote, "And what a precursor?" The German poet and writer Heinrich Heine was also Jewish, and he's one of Nietzsche's favorite writers. We find in the work of Heine, actually, this is a fun fact, there's this passage, quote, "Can't you hear those little bells tinkling? Down on your knees, they're bringing the sacraments to a dying God," end quote. So one of Nietzsche's most famous ideas is sort of approximated or prefigured here in the work of Heine. And so the ideas of Jewish thinkers sort of find their way into Nietzsche's philosophy and find their expression in him. And I think we can see in Nietzsche's politics and the idea of the good European a reflection of his philosophical heritage insofar as like his whole outlook as he draws on this whole collection of philosophical influences from all over Europe, all across European civilization, and from every nationality and ethnicity in Europe, and that includes the Jewish thinkers. And so that's one of the reasons why Nietzsche's able to create this approach of perspectivism, is by drawing on influences without regard to national borders or religious or ethnic differences. And so when you do that, you can sort of attempt to glimpse the world through the eyes of another human being from a different setting, a different set of circumstances, however limited that glimpse might be. And so that philosophically, Nietzsche is a good European, right? And that's what made him so politically. His approach prevented him from making politics a nationalistic thing, treating it from this nationalistic angle. And so therefore, that's why he has that passage that we looked at in the episode on the section, A Glance at the State. He wishes for the destruction of nations, right? Since that passage is relevant here, again, we're going to take another look at it. This is Human All-Too-Human number 475, but we're going to focus on one of the details of that passage we didn't spend too much time on the last time we looked at it. As you'll remember, Nietzsche says that once a man of intellect has understood that nationalism is sort of going the way of the buffalo and democracy is a resistless force in Europe, the man of intellect will perceive that Europe is, naturally going to form into a single society to reflect the fact that all of its nations are really part of a single civilization. And so as such, quote, he should be undaunted in presenting himself as a good European and should work actively on the merging of nations, end quote. But following this, Nietzsche gives us a rather succinct explanation of why anti-Semitism arises and how it's tied in with this desire to create a national identity by which the average and unremarkable people can sort of feel themselves lifted up as a consequence of their blood. And so Nietzsche writes, continuing in the same passage, and I'm going to quote here in an abridged form, quote, "The whole problem of the Jews exists only within national states, inasmuch as their energy and higher intelligence, their capital of spirit and will, awakens envy and hatred. As soon as it is no longer a matter of preserving nations, but rather producing the strongest possible mixed European race, the Jew becomes as useful and desirable an ingredient as any other national quantity," end quote. So Nietzsche's reasons for wanting a mixing of races is somewhat fascinating. It's because he held to a now kind of obscure theory of evolution that sort of runs parallel with the strain of thinking represented by Darwin. So Nietzsche believed in the theories of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. This is contrary to his great influence, Arthur Schopenhauer, who tended to dismiss Lamarck. Nietzsche is convinced that the view of evolution held by Lamarck would one day replace Darwinism. While Nietzsche was prescient in many things, it does seem he was wrong about this. But nevertheless, we can see the influence of Lamarck on many of Nietzsche's sentiments throughout his work. In the same book, in Human All-Too-Human, section 592, Nietzsche echoes the hypothesis of Lamarck that a human being could be somehow endowed through their genetics with a certain set of skills or attributes inherited from one's ancestors. So Nietzsche writes, quote, It is reasonable to develop further the talent that one's father or grandfather worked hard at, and not switch to something entirely new. Otherwise, one is depriving himself of the chance to attain perfection in some one craft. Thus the saying, "Which street should you take? That of your ancestors." End quote. So Lamarckianism has basically been rejected by the scientific community today, but it's worth noting that Nietzsche's intuitions may have been at least partially correct insofar as the study of epigenetics has suggested that certain traits or skills might be brought out by an individual's environment or upbringing. But nevertheless, for Nietzsche, this culminates in an understanding of human beings that could justifiably be called eugenics, that there are means of breeding human beings that could produce better human beings. Now, what's important about this, because after all, this is an episode meant to show Nietzsche's criticism of fascism, what's important, for one, we should be intellectually honest enough to say where he is actually in agreement with them. But on the other hand, I think it's important to note that belief in eugenics at the time was not really an unusual thing. I'm going to draw on the argument of Robert Solomon here. He wrote in his book What Nietzsche Really Said, which is a sort of beginner's guide to Nietzsche. Solomon writes, quote, "Almost every intellectual of the period took eugenics seriously, including George Bernard Shaw in England. Hitler's use of the gas chamber in the service of his own perverse plan to shape the species was not a strategy Nietzsche either suggested or imagined." End quote. The operative difference here, in fact, is that Nietzsche thinks the whole species of humankind can actually be strengthened by combining all the different ethnic backgrounds to maximize the number of skills and aptitudes that our offspring might produce. So for Nietzsche, therefore, eugenics means the opposite of what it means for the Nazi race theorist. His form of eugenics, it must be said, and outdated as it is, it stands in direct opposition to the racist ideas of somehow maintaining these pure, separate, individual ethnicities. Now, Nietzsche also acknowledges that this process could have downsides. I don't want to just present it like Nietzsche was just for race mixing. I mean, he says people might also pass on and combine the various pathologies or faults of the various ethnicities. And then we can also then bring in the fact that it's kind of dubitable whether people are actually passing on traits and skills in this Lamarckian way. But the point remains that wherever he writes about this in his published work, he always seems to come down on the side that combining different cultures and ethnicities is how you create new ones. And that's always been true, that every people on earth that exists gains its identity out of a mingling of ancestral peoples through trade and cohabitation and, even in some cases through conquest and things of that nature. And so when we see Nietzsche's ideas here, even though they seem a little bit 19th century in their approach, he openly asserts this goal of breaking down all the European nations and bringing forth the strongest possible mixed European man, right? And so we can see here why Nietzsche's approach to the entire concept of race sort of sets him in opposition to movements like the Nazis, who were looking for what they called racial purity. And the reason why Nietzsche wouldn't hold to an idea of racial purity actually goes to the very heart of his philosophical project and the deepest, most fundamental values on which he bases his thought. And so we have the Heraclitean rejection of being, right? And the embrace of becoming. That's very central to this here. Nietzsche rejects those categories of existence which are stable and independent and, which cohere and endure as separate, distinct things with a sort of an essence, so to say, right? And Nietzsche says instead that the only real existence is the phenomena, which is the experience of sensations, of people and events, of things perceived within the senses, right? That there's no underlying essence or thingness to anything, that existence takes place purely within this realm of appearance. But as we know, all of those appearances, all these sensations are fleeting. All phenomena arise and pass away, and it's only within that world of abstraction or within our representation of phenomena that there exists anything like being, which is this enduring essence. Becoming is the only reality for Nietzsche, and so we have to conclude that something like a race or an ethnicity, it might become, right? But it doesn't possess an essence in and of itself. It is simply the current manifestation of one genetic line, which came from other genetic lines, which had to interconnect and combine in order for this one to come forward. And this sort of dovetails into another point in which Nietzsche's ideas differ with the likes of the Nazis, because his idea of will to power is also antithetical to the entire concept of race as far as the Nazis saw it, insofar as the character of all life is change and transformation, and the overcoming of what one is. And so the Aryan race, right? Therefore, you could never see that as something that should be preserved for 1,000 years or however long. Which is like the utopian vision of the Nazis. We're going to have a Reich, a political order that will preserve our race for 1,000 years. That ultimately that's based on the same static idea of being. And that same stasis is at the end of their program, or as the basis of their whole program, right? It's the fabled promise. But for Nietzsche, life is mutation. It's the exception that drives the species forward. And the species is not a thing. It's not a thing in the sense of being an object or an essence, but it's more like Heraclitus's river. It's something flowing and changing. So the idea of an ethnicity or a genome having quote-unquote purity is rather foreign from Nietzsche's concept of life, because this suggests that some sort of ideal state has already been reached and must now be preserved, when in fact Nietzsche thinks that seeking for that state of stasis is kind of a tongue twister. It's sort of like a secret yearning for death. And accordingly, Eco points this out in his work, that fascism is always a cult of death. They'd rather die heroically and be martyred for their traditionalist cause than live on to see society change and transform into something new. And that's why some fascist sects even adopted the mantra, long live death, which is kind of a contradiction in terms if you think about it. But now, of course, there's a number of important differences between the outlook of Umberto Eco and that of Nietzsche. So, for example, Eco sees this cult of death as essentially the same as the cult of heroism, whereas for Nietzsche, heroism is something he celebrates. The fascist, Eco points out, sees life as a constant struggle, which you could say Nietzsche also believes. But the way Eco points it is that they believe one should live to struggle rather than struggle to live. And Eco approvingly sees liberal democratic societies as engaged in the struggle to live, and the fascists are opposed to it, and that they crave like this permanent state of warfare. But there's a contradiction here too that Eco points out, and he says, quote, "Since enemies have to be defeated, there must be a final battle, after which the movement will have control of the world. But such a final solution implies a further era of peace, a golden age, which contradicts the principle of permanent war. No fascist leader has ever succeeded in solving this predicament," end quote. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to incorporate Eco's understanding of fascism to sort of ground us here, because not only does Nietzsche sound the same notes as Eco in many places, he also disagrees with him on other points, right? So here in this passage on permanent warfare, we see very clearly both how Nietzsche could easily be mistaken for a fascist if you were to do like a superficial reading, but also why his ideas are incommensurate with theirs, because Nietzsche never argues for a golden age. He never argues for this final state or final solution to be reached, or the idea that there's going to be a final defeat of one's enemies. Nietzsche, following in the footsteps of Heraclitus, treats war as Heraclitus says, the father of all, and strife is justice. War is eternal whether we like it or not. This is what's represented by nature, a war of all against all. And that, in fact, the idea of an end to this conflict is somewhat in contradiction with Nietzsche's ideas. In some sense, we could even say the concept of the final solution is like an echo of the apocalyptic struggle at the end of existence that we inherit from Christianity in the book of Revelations, right? It's like this fiery process of purification in which all the sin is cleansed away. And that's why a Nietzschean would argue that desire for the final victory, it exists because it's inherited from Christianity and is therefore at odds with the idea that life is struggle, right? It means that the fascist ideology is either inherently contradictory or that they didn't really believe that life was struggle to begin with and sought, just as the Christians did, for another sort of secret bypath to nothingness, to death, right? And so tellingly, just as early Christians misinterpreted Heraclitus by interpreting his ever-living fire, his idea that all things come into being through fire and return to the fire, early Christian interpreters treated this as a prophecy of a fiery apocalypse, right? Meaning that Heraclitus was saying the same thing they were saying, go figure. But so too with Nietzsche, the proto-fascists interpret things like his overman idea not as this infinite horizon of betterment and elevation of the species, something for mankind to eternally reach for, but as an ending, as a final state that can be attained, right? At which point the process of transformation can stop, and we exit becoming and enter a permanent state of being. And so, accordingly, in German schools, we see this misunderstanding of Nietzsche's work on full display, where the German soldiers are referred to as Übermenschen. So the Overman is no longer a thing beyond the horizon of human possibility. It's something that we've already reached. And by making ourselves an instrument of the state, that's how we reach it. And so Elisabeth Nietzsche, she would later fabricate a story that Friedrich Nietzsche came up with his idea of will to power while watching German soldiers charging the enemy in the Franco-Prussian War, that he perceived that their will to die a heroic death somehow overruled their will to live. And so that was her claim, that he perceived the will to power, that Schopenhauer's view of the will had to be incorrect. He perceives this while watching the German soldiers. And so again, notice here how the will to power is presented. It's not presented in all its full implications as the striving to become something greater, but it's reduced to a heroic death. Now, certainly heroism is part of Nietzsche's will to power, and even being willing to die for the sake of something higher than one's own life, right? But Elisabeth's focus sort of excludes the creative element of the will to power. The characterization of the Overman becomes the rank and file of the German soldiers, which seems to me to be almost like an insult to Nietzsche's philosophy. And so Nietzsche differs very greatly with these movements, even though Nietzsche does celebrate war. And that's something that Stephen Hicks, among others, has pointed out, that Nietzsche shares with fascist thought, but that he rejects this fascistic promise of a final victory in war and this promise of this lasting peace at the end, and that he thinks that to do so, to seek to leave the cycle of becoming and enter a permanent state of being, whether that might be a permanent state, a permanent victory, or a permanent pure race that you've created, right? That is in itself seeking for death, because life is struggle, war, transformation, becoming. And so whether it's the Rousseauian return to the idyllic garden or the attainment of this 1,000-year Reich, Nietzsche sees the same desire. It's this romantic yearning for a release from struggle. When we look to the other intellectual roots of Nazism, it becomes clearer why they would believe in these concepts such as racial purity, and they descend from an entirely opposite line of thought to that of Nietzsche. One of the organizations that preceded the Nazi Party was a group called the Thule Society. Rudolf Hess, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Julius Lehmann, Gottfried Feder, Dietrich Eckart, and Karl Herrer were all members. This group was primarily concerned with occult racial theories which were popular at the time. According to these theories, the various quote-unquote races of mankind were not created by, an evolutionary process of intermingling. They're not simply a family resemblance that sort of comes out of this dynamic biological process of reproduction. Rather, all mankind today is descended from 7 or 8 original racial groups who arrive as these sort of spiritual beings, right? So there was a sort of golden age when these ancestral races were all stronger and longer lived and more perfect over time. But, all the mixing of these races produces a degeneration. So notice the total inversion here. The traditionalist or occult belief system, which posits an original perfection in a golden age from which we've degenerated, versus Nietzsche, who argues that we had to struggle and claw our way out of this more animal form, right? That man is a bridge from ape to overman. that there's still much within us that's still ape, right? And so on and so forth. So Nietzsche's viewpoint would naturally lead one to have a positive view of transformation and change, whereas the occult or the traditionalist view upon which these racial purity ideas are founded leads you to wish for a return and for stasis, for a lack of change. Himmler, who was one of Hitler's right-hand men, the head of the SS, he's perhaps the most high-ranking occultist thinker among the Nazis, and he's influenced by things like the Oeralinga book, which is this book that put forward these ideas of primordial races from which modern humanity was descended. And as an example of his wacky occult beliefs, that black sun logo of Himmler's was created by arranging all these Sieg runes into a circle to create the appearance of a sun. And, the Sieg rune, as you probably know, that's the S in the SS logo, right, with the sharp, hard angles to it. And that's because Himmler, in at least this way, is not too different from a hippie New Ager from California, because he believed in manifesting things. That by focusing your will on an image or symbol that represents a certain outcome, you can sort of force that outcome to come into existence, right? And so the Sieg rune, which is the victory rune, becomes the object of an entire nation's focus. And so through this new agey process of manifestation, they could all collectively manifest victory, manifest it into being by willing it hard enough. And that's also why there were something like 36,000 swastikas, if I remember correctly, that appear in that notorious Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will, because of their belief that they could succeed simply by creating this sigil to represent their ideology and getting a whole nation to focus on it and believe in it. Now, I should say that my analysis here of putting a lot of importance on these occult theories is somewhat controversial. It's been debated by historians as to what degree of influence these occult theories actually have on the Nazis. But I bring them up because I don't think you can really make sense of the Nazi concept of race without it. That you have to recognize that for racism, in its pure form, to really make sense, you have to have this metaphysical idea of race as this essential quality that exists and somehow exists within a whole people as part of their identity, but it's outside of anything that could be explained by this biological process of evolution, right? Because if you accept that, you would have to accept that races aren't quote-unquote pure. What would that even mean? So without this metaphysical belief that there's some sort of essence to each race of human beings, that idea sort of collapses in the face of evolution. Now, for Hitler himself, there's no evidence that he really went in for the more wacky theories, but while he did reject his Catholicism, he still sort of remarked that he wouldn't go against the church because he recognized Christianity as essential to the German identity. He had to use it to motivate his people. And so Hitler, in many respects, he echoed the ideas of Bernhard Foster from decades earlier, Elisabeth Nietzsche's husband. Like Foster, Hitler believed that Jesus was an Aryan fighter and that he also had this sort of ambivalent attitude towards Christianity. Albert Speer wrote that Hitler would say, quote, "You see, it's been our misfortune to have the wrong religion. Why didn't we have the religion of the Japanese, who regard sacrifice for the fatherland as the highest good? The Mohammedan religion, too, would have been much more compatible to us than Christianity. Why did it have to be Christianity, with its meekness and flabbiness?" End quote. Now, again, at first glance, this may seem like something that Nietzsche might say, and so it's worth spending a moment explaining how Nietzsche's view of Christianity differs substantially. We might consider the way Foster wrote about Jesus, quote, "On the dark background of the most depraved of all nations, the Jews, the bright future of the Savior of the world would stand out more impressively," end quote. So there's like these sort of pained attempts to separate Jesus somehow from his ethnicity because of the inconvenience of it all. And this led the Nazis and proto-Nazis to wish that there could be some other religion by which the German people could be led. But nevertheless, they held Christianity to be superior to Judaism, obviously. And that's Stephen Hicks characterizes it this way. Which leads us to another important difference with Nietzsche, because for Nietzsche, Judaism is superior to Christianity. Jesus, rather than an Aryan, is described by Nietzsche, along with St. Paul, as, quote, "the two most Jewish Jews who ever lived," end quote. Now, a corollary to that, right, is he famously writes in the Antichrist, section 39, quote, "There was never more than one Christian, and he died on the cross. The gospel died on the cross. That which thenceforward was called gospel was the reverse of that gospel that Christ had lived. It was evil tidings, a disangel," end quote. So in other words, the followers of Jesus never measure up to his example. Jesus lives in this total denial of reality, and for him salvation is always immediately at hand. The kingdom of God is within you, and so on. Nietzsche characterizes the Northern Europeans who would later adopt this religion of this Middle Eastern Jew as, he describes them as hard, cruel men who use the Christian religion to vent their cruelty onto themselves and inflict this self-hatred onto others. And so he says that Christianity most appealed among people like the Teutonic Germans to the strong but botched men, as he calls them, people with cruel instincts who nevertheless had failed to succeed in life, and could therefore adopt this narrative of original sin and the impurity of the world in order to explain their failures as springing from this fundamental injustice, or whatever it might be. This attitude of Nietzsche's comes out in another aspect of his philosophy, insofar as he believes that the Old Testament is superior to the New Testament, that the table of values held by the Jewish people and their honor of their father and mother, their God, which appeared to be both good and evil, insofar as he's both sort of wrathful and gracious, and had to be appeased by sacrifices, and so on and so forth. Everything in the Old Testament, Nietzsche thinks, is a far more healthy religious feeling than this total denial of the world promoted by Christianity, right? And the Christian doctrines of poverty and chastity and so on. But so to disentangle all of this then and put a fine point on it, the Nazis are forced to embrace Christianity in spite of their problems with it, because their whole movement is based on reifying the national identity of the Germans and uplifting all of the things that the most average German believes in. They have, therefore, to hold that Jesus is somehow separate and better than the rest of the Jews, because Christianity has to be superior to Judaism. Nietzsche basically believes the opposite. Christianity should be overcome precisely because it's the consolation and comfort of the most average person and the weapon of the botched and the failures, and that on the other side of that coin, Jesus is inseparable from Judaism. In fact, he's the most Jewish Jew that ever lived. And that's whom the Christians could never measure up to, right? And so, I don't know. I think it would be a mistake to see any of these Nazis' ideas about the Jews or about Jesus as like sober, rational arguments, because as Nietzsche has already reminded us, all of these arguments exist in order to satisfy their own psychological needs, satisfy a place to vent their envy and resentment and create this, this group that they can harness the mass energy of. So these arguments are not flowing forth from rational principles. They're created to serve a purpose. So in light of all this, though, that we've talked about up to this point, I want to look at a passage in Beyond Good and Evil 250. Quote, "What does Europe owe to the Jews? Many things both good and bad, but mainly one thing that is both best and worst, the grand style and morality, the horror and majesty of infinite demands, infinite meanings, the whole romanticism and sublimity of the morally questionable, and consequently precisely the most appealing, insidious, and exceptional aspect of those plays of colors and seductions to life, in whose afterglow the sky of our present European culture, its evening sky, glows away, and perhaps goes away. That is why, among the spectators and philosophers, artists like us regard the Jews with gratitude." End quote. So, in some sense, this passage is complicated. In some sense, it's not. In the bottom line, I think he says there at the end, we philosophers, spectators, people with an artistic spirit in us, we regard the Jews with gratitude. But the Jews give us Jesus, who creates this religion of world denial, and, there's this very tension of the soul that this religion produces, the infinite demands and infinite meanings and the sublimity of the morally questionable. But this is all inextricably part of the development of the European psyche. The Jewish religion helps also develop this idea of the ascetic or the sage as the ideal man, which is a figure that points beyond the horizons of where mankind is now. It also threatens us with that danger that the value in life will be invested in an afterlife, right? But above all, the Jews are a distinctive identity that historically gave something to the European civilization. So you should have gratitude to those who have given you a gift, right? And they also provide us with an admirable model insofar as they are able to endure even in the face of suffering and persecution, right? They wander from place to place for centuries without being fully accepted anywhere, and they make great contributions to culture, but they're always despised for their success. In many ways, this treatment of the Jewish people fulfills Nietzsche's criteria for what makes somebody great, right? That one is worth something is proved by the fact that they're able to endure and survive and face these challenges and hardships and be made stronger by it. Even in Nietzsche's idea of the wanderer, he suggests that some of the inspiration might have come from the Jewish people when Zarathustra says that he is, quote, the eternally wandering Jew, except that I am not eternal and not a Jew, end quote. In other words, that in spite of the fact that Zarathustra preaches becoming instead of being, right, and that he teaches us to sound out the morality of every idol so that we can understand all of these past dogmas and belief systems and in order to move beyond them, right, that there's something about the metaphor of the wandering Jew that suits Zarathustra, insofar as he's this exceptional person who's regarded as evil by the majority, distrusted because of his joy in existence, and especially that joy when it manifests in spite of his great suffering. Man, you'll never be treated with greater suspicion by the outside world. And so, in light of all this, why did the Nazis attempt to use Nietzsche? Why did they attempt to appropriate his ideas? How could that have happened? The first culprit that's often named is Elisabeth, and not without, some evidence for that. It was the same year as her husband's suicide that Nietzsche lost his mind and was committed to the hospital at Jena. And so Elisabeth would later take her brother in and care for him until he died in the year 1900. And during that time, and even after Nietzsche's death, she would attempt to effect this transformation of Nietzsche's image in order to create this vision of him as a forerunner to the Nazi party. And the way she did this was manifold. For one, she wrote a great deal about her brother and even began to fabricate some of his own writings, including a notorious book she wrote about Nietzsche in which she quoted him questioning his own atheism and included anecdotes such as the one we mentioned about Nietzsche discovering the will to power by watching German soldiers. She also compiled the book Will to Power with Heinrich Koselleck, whom Nietzsche often calls Peter Gast. While the notes they use in the book are genuine, they nevertheless arrange the text in such a way as to suggest that it was Nietzsche's magnum opus, rather than simply a collection of notes, often put into sequences that Nietzsche did not intend, and therefore could lead one to draw conclusions about Nietzsche's line of thinking that were forced onto the text. Elisabeth then began including fabrications in the Nietzsche archive, and Karl Schlechte eventually confronted her about this once he realized what was going on. The result, however, was that Elisabeth eventually was successfully able to harness the image of Nietzsche for her own ends, and after his death, he was adopted by these proto-Nazis as one of their own. She lived long enough to meet Hitler personally, and Hitler even attended her funeral when she died. And so it's obvious whose interpretation of Nietzsche influenced the Nazis. It was Elisabeth's, right? It was a distorted interpretation. And as for her reasons, we may never know. It may simply be that she'd always idolized her brother and looked up to him and sought to emulate him, but that she never truly understood him, right? Nietzsche himself says as much, writing that Elisabeth, quote, lacks any sense for fine and even for crude logical distinctions. Her thinking is void of even the least logical consistency, and she lacks any sense of objectivity, end quote. Nevertheless, the damage was done. When Nietzsche's writings were published in Nazi Germany, therefore, they cherry-picked whatever they could find to support their arguments and selectively edited his aphorisms in order to remove anything that might be uncomfortable or contradictory to the party doctrine. Stephen J. Vicchio writes, quote, under the Nazis, an expurgated edition of Der Antichrist, a few anthologists of Nietzsche's work, and some unconscionable books about him gained currency. Hitler probably never read any of Nietzsche's books, nor could any of them be used effectively in the expurgated form. In fact, very few writers have ever been as hard on nationalism, socialism, labor unions, Germans, or what Nietzsche called party men. Indeed, in Der Antichrist, Nietzsche says, of necessity, the party man becomes a liar. End quote. The Nazis, of course, knew of Nietzsche's friendship with Wagner, however, and in their narrative, the break between the two men, if addressed at all, was reduced to a purely personal dispute. While we have covered this before in the podcast, I'll go over the ideological aspect of that dispute once again, as it is easily expressible in terms of those three key points, and that if you understand those three aspects of Wagner that Nietzsche attacked, you understand something very important about Nietzsche and his attack on fascism. Nietzsche rejects Wagnerianism because Wagner becomes nationalistic. He writes that he couldn't forgive that Wagner became Reichsdeutsch. He said that the motto Deutschland über alles is the death of German philosophy. Second, that Wagner embraces Christianity. And Nietzsche writes in the preface to Assorted Maxims and Opinions, the second book of Human All Too Human, that Richard Wagner, who appeared all-conquering, was revealed to be a helpless, despairing romantic who collapsed, broken before the Christian cross. Lutheranism is, of course, the religious identity of the German traditionalist whom Wagner came to identify with. And then finally, anti-Semitism, which is the aspect that we've been discussing at length already. And so Wagner's writing, it's perhaps one of the most caustic examples of German nationalism and of anti-Semitism that one could look for. Wagner wrote in a letter to King Ludwig that the Jewish race is, quote, the born enemy of pure humanity and everything that is noble in it, end quote. And he further yearned for a, quote, real rebirth of racial feeling in Germany, end quote. Wagner promoted the idea that would later be reinforced by occult beliefs that blood crossings led to the degeneration of the human race. Ernest Newman, a critic of both Wagner and Nietzsche, blamed both men for giving rise to the Nazi Party, but he seems to attribute more of the blame to Nietzsche. One of the noteworthy sections of Walter Kaufmann's book on Nietzsche is his criticism of Newman for failing to distinguish between Nietzsche and Wagner, and thus making the same mistake the Nazis did in interpreting him. Newman accepts the distortion of Elisabeth when he writes, quote, could 50 Wagners have led the nation into worse disasters than one Nietzsche has done, end quote. Kaufmann's response to this is a classic in my book. Kaufmann writes, quote, Hitler, of course, knew 50 times as much about Wagner as he did about Nietzsche, and Wagner's essays, unlike Nietzsche's, did not have to be expurgated by the Nazis before being used in schools, end quote. In those Nazi schools, a prominent figure was Alfred Baumler. He was a philosophy professor who believed Nietzsche prophesied the rise of fascism in Germany. Baumler was called by the Nazis to Berlin to provide a curriculum for teaching Nietzsche's work that would be acceptable to the Reich. His exegetic principles, Walter Kaufmann writes, included, quote, the premise that Nietzsche did not mean what he wrote in his books, end quote. Others, such as Dies, have agreed with Kaufmann on this point, that the political theories put forth by Baumler are more of a metastasis of his own ideas, rather than anything having to do with Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche, the philosopher who attacked metaphysics and who attacked these ideas of a grand political idealism, is then characterized by the likes of Baumler as a metaphysician, first and foremost, and as a fascist political theorist. Kaufmann writes in his book, quote, the picture of Nietzsche as a great metaphysician appeared together with the conception of Nietzsche as politiker. Not only are both these theses defended together in the same book by Baumler, but they are based on the same principles of exegesis, namely the concentration on fragments and notes which are willfully arranged to yield a system that is quite remote from Nietzsche's own intentions, end quote. And so that's how somebody like Nietzsche, who would fantasize during his later years, admittedly when his sanity was waning, of having all the anti-Semites in the country shot. That's how Nietzsche could be adopted by the Nazis, through lies and distortions and by expurgating his works, by receiving him through the interpretation of his sister and by men like Baumler, who were, shall we say, motivated in their reasoning. And finally, by critics like Newman, failing to actually read Nietzsche or familiarize themselves with his statements or the events of his life or the influence of Jewish philosophers on his thought, and so on and so forth, and so accepting these distortions of the fascists. But the reality that's sometimes uncomfortable is that there are these similarities in Nietzsche's thought. I would argue that sometimes these similarities are somewhat more superficial than people make them out to be, since when you examine the details, you find that Nietzsche is simply operating from different starting principles of thought. But for the sake of completeness, and again with this aim of intellectual honesty, I want to consider the list of Stephen Hicks in his book Nietzsche and the Nazis, in which he finds what he sees to be 5 similarities and 5 differences in thought between the two. So in Hicks's words, here are the 5 similarities. Quote, "The Nazis were strongly collectivistic, and Nietzsche, with some qualifications, also advances strongly collectivistic and anti-individualistic themes. Both Nietzsche and the Nazis see zero-sum conflict as inescapable and as fundamental to the human condition. Both are irrationalists in their psychological theories, downplaying radically the role that reason plays in life and emphasizing the power and the glory of instincts and feelings. Both Nietzsche and the Nazis accept willingly, even longingly, that war is necessary, healthy, and even majestic. And finally, both Nietzsche and the Nazis are anti-democratic, anti-capitalistic, and anti-liberal. And so, come the 1930s, the Nazis were in fundamental opposition to those nations to the West that were still broadly committed to democracy, capitalism, and liberalism." End quote. So those are the similarities. Now for the 5 differences, again in Hicks' words here. Quote, "The Nazis believe the German Aryan to be superior, while Nietzsche believes that the superior types can be manifested in any racial type. The Nazis believe contemporary German culture to be the highest and best hope for the world, whereas Nietzsche holds contemporary German culture to be degenerate and to be infecting the rest of the world. The Nazis are enthusiastically anti-Semitic, while Nietzsche sees anti-Semitism to be a moral sickness. The Nazis hate all things Jewish, while Nietzsche praises the Jews for their toughness, their intelligence, and their sheer survival ability. And finally, the Nazis see Christianity to be radically different and much superior to Judaism, while Nietzsche believes Judaism and Christianity to be essentially the same, with Christianity being, in fact, a worse and more dangerous variation of Judaism." End quote. Now, I think a couple things about this list that I could say here. I don't fully agree with Hicks, but I think he brings out some interesting things. So for one, if we look at the list of differences, what we find is that mostly those are aspects of fascism which either apply specifically to the Nazis or to like the racist variety of fascism in general. And what I mean by this is that Hicks is pretty much correct here that Nietzsche considers Germany to be inferior culturally to much of Europe, right? Especially in comparison to the French, for example. And Nietzsche has a particular critique of Christianity, and he has a particular fondness for the Jewish people, right? But would these critiques of fascism apply to fascism in another context, in, say, Imperial Japan? Like in that case, we have an aggressive, expansionist, nationalistic power who's also driven by notions of racial supremacy. But Nietzsche's critiques of anti-Semitism specifically don't really apply there, right? Neither would his critiques of Germany if we're talking about Japan. And so, in fact, the only real difference Hicks cites that would apply to racial socialism in general, also known as National Socialism, right? This particular variety of fascism based on race, based on having an ethnostate, is that Nietzsche doesn't think that particular races are uniquely superior, which is true. He thinks that there are superior individuals that can occur in any ethnicity. But the entire premise of racism falls apart because the focus on traits that are shared by entire nations are necessarily going to be the average common traits and an average common identity. And so Nietzsche just isn't oriented that same way in his thought. He's radically hierarchical in his thought. But by the same token, he can't take seriously any sort of idea of a race or a pure race. That would level the hierarchy between individuals if individuals have to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the Aryan race, right? For example. Or to turn to Japan. There's that Japanese proverb that the tallest blade of grass is the one that must be cut. The idea of the individual is merely instrumental for the good of the collective. So Nietzsche is opposed to that on that basis, right? So to sum up all of these concerns, essentialism doesn't really work in Nietzsche's world of becoming. And also because humanity and all of its family groups are evolving, and because Nietzsche's goal is change and transformation and not preservation, taking pride in your race basically means you're an unremarkable person who just wants, you have nothing else to take pride in, and so you just want your way of life to be the same forever. It's ultimately, middle-class fear, self-preservative goals, this, that, and the other. That should be rather clear from everything we've talked about here. But I guess what I'm saying is I don't think Hicks sufficiently teases out those principles as we've been talking about them, that even though I've used specifically the example of anti-Semitism, right, you could apply this in any context. It doesn't have to be specifically referring to Germany, specifically referring to the Jewish people. So I agree with Hicks that all these points are true, that these are actual disagreements between Nietzsche and the Nazis. And, the point of his book is to contrast Nietzsche with the Nazis specifically, and not just fascists in general. But I think the disagreements he points out between the two are far too specific, I'll say, right? A great example of this point is point 1 in his supposed agreements between Nietzsche and the Nazis. Quote, "The Nazis were strongly collectivistic, and Nietzsche, with some qualifications, also advances strongly collectivistic and anti-individualistic themes," end quote. Those some qualifications that he mentions, those are actually really important, right? Nietzsche's not really a collectivist any more than he's an individualist, speaking here in the political sense. Like, maybe Nietzsche is an individualist in the spiritual sense, or something like that, but Hicks is correct that he's not an individualist in the political realm. And in that sense, Hicks is also correct to call Nietzsche an enemy of liberal democratic enlightenment, right? Or of the focus on individual rights and freedoms as the goal of the political system. But on the other hand, it's difficult for me to reconcile the label of a collectivist with that of Nietzsche, except insofar as he simply acknowledges that the collective power structures exist and that they are more powerful than the individual. And so in some sense, one has to treat with them. You have to accept their existence. You have to accept the collective's power. And one should understand why those power structures exist and why they arose and why we can't just get rid of them. But, and also why the average person will naturally be attracted to identifying with them, right? But I don't think that Nietzsche morally advocated for collectivism, insofar as his audience that he's writing to are the free spirits, as he himself says. He's writing to those who find themselves outside of the collective mode of valuation, outside of the moral sentiment of the many. And so the kind of people that Zarathustra gathers as followers are not going to be, he's not giving them a message to subordinate their will to the collective. We simply don't get that message in Nietzsche. What we do have is a description of the state as this objectification of instinct, right? We have a descriptive analysis of how the collective will expresses itself and how the collective will impresses itself into our experience as this feeling of obeying and commanding. And we have an understanding of what benefit the state is to ourselves and so on. And so much of Nietzsche's work involves a critique of the morality of the many and the morality of the utility of the many, and sort of this enticement for us to entertain these strange, wicked, questionable thoughts, to wander in the forbidden country of the philosophical thoughts in which the community has set its ban. To be like Zarathustra, that eternally wandering Jew, right? That's the image he gives us, rather than that of the German rank-and-file soldier. So, again, I would disagree with Hicks here. I think it's the nuances of Nietzsche's understanding of power and our relationship to society and the state that could be counted as another thing that actually differentiates him from the fascists of all the stripes they arise in, right? I wouldn't treat it as a qualified similarity. It's more like a qualified difference. So Hicks comes out with some strange interpretations here and there. Again, in the similarities, Hicks writes, quote, "Both Nietzsche and the Nazis see zero-sum conflict as inescapable and as fundamental to the human condition," end quote. But as we've discussed, the Nazis, like all fascists, they seek for that final solution, that final victory. Their whole ideology is apocalyptic Christianity recreated in another form, in which there's this cleansing of sin. Sin is reified into the figure of the Jew and the evil conspiracy against the Aryans. But in the end, it's this desire to reach this utopia after this final victory. And as Eco argues, that's that contradiction that the fascists can never reconcile. So again, is this really a qualified similarity? Or are the Nazis actually in contradiction with Nietzsche, in contradiction with Heraclitus, by thinking they can win the war to end all wars, right? So I value Hick's perspective, and reading his views was very informative on this topic, but I also somewhat disagree with him. I think that Nietzsche is far less similar to the Nazis than Hicks perceives, and that in his differences, he has more fundamental disagreements with them, which I think I've been able to bring out throughout this episode. The problem isn't just anti-Semitism. It's the creation of this evil conspiracy figure to like reify your hatred and envy and bring out the pathology of the people in the average in order to harness their popular energy, right? It's not just a problem with Germany. It's a problem with that, what would you say, that averageness, that stubbornness, that Ludditeness, that worship of the salt of the earth person as the ideal type, right? That he sees in the German culture. That's becoming a problem. But that would be a problem for Nietzsche wherever it arose. It isn't just a problem with Germany. It's not as if this is the thing that many people actually, they make the mistake of treating the Germans as a people with an essence, or the Jews as a people with an essence, right? Right. So the anti-Jewish hatred, it's not that there's some sort of essential thing that Nietzsche disagrees with there. He disagrees with that pattern of behavior, that pattern of psychology. Germanness is not some essential quality of the Germans. It's just where Germany is at this particular time and place during the 19th century as Nietzsche perceives it. And that in past times, people like Goethe, right? There were Germans who broke out of that mold or who represented a different era in German thought. And so implicit in that whole idea is that the Germans could change, right? And so the problem isn't like the German people as such, I guess we could say. We shouldn't think about any of this essentially or in essentialist terms, because that's just playing into these same like mistakes, these mistakes of metaphysical thinking. So in any case, I think it'll be valuable at the end of the episode here to briefly consider Nietzsche in contrast with that other main variety of fascism, which we have best represented in a figure like Mussolini. Mussolini and his brand of Italian corporate fascism is actually a far tougher opponent to critique from the Nietzschean angle, because the Nazis, they attempted to appropriate Nietzsche, so there's always been more of a discussion about that angle of things, and that's the most famous iteration of fascism, so we spent most of our time on them. But I think it's a lot scarier or tougher to consider the impact of Nietzsche's philosophy on Mussolinian fascism. And that's because Mussolini's intellectual line of descent wasn't from kooky theories about mystical bloodlines, but or conspiracies about an evil cabal that conspired to degenerate the Italian race or anything like that. But Mussolini comes out of socialism, right? I mean, he rejects socialism eventually, but he's more grounded in this analysis of history based on material conditions and power relationships rather than these metaphysical ideas about race, which depend on essentialism. Mussolini's a relativist, right? And this kind of morally relativistic approach to fascism, which recognizes the reality of hierarchy and the power of the collective and makes it into an ends, that's much, much harder to argue against from a Nietzschean angle. Mussolini makes this terrifyingly clear when he writes, quote, "If relativism signifies contempt for fixed categories and those who claim to be the bearers of objective, immortal truth, then there is nothing more relativistic than fascist attitudes and activity. From the fact that all ideologies are of equal value, we fascists conclude that we have the right to create our own ideology and enforce it with all the energy of which we are capable." End quote. So there you go, right? People who want to discredit Nietzsche, I'm giving you the ammunition so that I can steelman your argument here. But don't use the tired accusation that Nietzsche was a Nazi, because decades of scholarship and the man's own statements prove that that's the opposite of the truth. But if you look at somebody like Mussolini, it's much, much harder to differentiate the two. But I think there's a line of attack for doing so, which I will attempt, and it has to do with the state. Perhaps Mussolini's most famous declaration was, quote, "Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state," end quote. Why? Why make the state the all-encompassing be-all, end-all of human life? What drives Mussolini to make this statement? Well, for Mussolini, the state is the objectification of one's values. It's how one's ideal is realized by means of force. And that means all moral and meta-ethical discussion is completely worthless prattle, right? Unless one actually attempts to realize one's moral values in the physical world. And that requires the use of force. The state is that monopoly on force, which means, therefore, that Mussolinian fascism, in its sort of brutal, realistic take on power, always aims to take charge of the state from a very honest, power grab, right? That the state, as an entity emerging from the collective power of the nation, is above any one individual, and as the power that creates order within society and allows culture to exist, and for the preservation and prosperity of the people, the state's good simply must be held up as above all the constituent parts, above all the individuals. It's the thing that gives them all life, right? And so the state becomes the body, for which all of us are only its organs, or we might say its cells. Corporatism, right? Deriving from corpus, which means body. And so Nietzsche can be distinguished from Mussolini, though, by this very identification of the state as the highest good. We discussed this somewhat last week, since Nietzsche's critique of socialism also involves his concern of the state swelling to great proportions and strangling culture and preventing mankind from continuing to advance. The tendency of the state is for stasis, for ossifying into this never-ending status quo. An all-powerful state, therefore, always becomes hostile to culture, and Nietzsche identifies this throughout his work. We might think of the statement of Goering, the famous or infamous quote, "Whenever I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun." And this aspect of being hostile to culture is shared between the Nazis and the Italian fascists. It's shared by anyone who sees political power as the sole goal of their ideology. Nietzsche's understanding of power is based on growth and creativity, whereas this fascistic understanding of power is based on what you might call stasis and retention or something like that. Perhaps nowhere is Nietzsche's far more negative view of the state put forward in starker terms than in that well-known chapter of Thus Spoke Zarathustra entitled The New Idol. And here Nietzsche writes of everything he sees in the modern state that seems to be inevitably pushing toward a fascistic worship of state power as the new idol of mankind. I'll read from it here in an abridged form. Quote, "A state? What is that? Well, open now your ears unto me, for now I will say unto you my word concerning the death of peoples. A state is called the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly lieth it also, and this lie creepeth from its mouth. I, the state, am the people. It is a lie. Creators were they who created peoples, and hung a faith and a love over them. Thus they served life. The state, I call it, where all are poison drinkers, the good and the bad. The state where all lose themselves, the good and the bad. The state where the slow suicide of all is called life. Towards the throne they all strive. It is their madness, as if happiness sat on the throne. Oft times sitteth filth on the throne, and oft times also the throne on filth." End quote. And so the Nietzschean argument applies just as much to any form of authoritarian fascism as it does to the Nazis, that the reification of the state into the highest value is the slow suicide of life. Why? Why would that be the case? Isn't all life exploitation, domination, subordination? Well, yes, but the conclusions that Nietzsche draws from this are very different from those of Mussolini, who therefore wishes to affirm his relativistic right to use the state for whatever moral ends he therefore wishes to implement. Because while Nietzsche is a relativist too, he recognizes that every valuation, when implemented in reality and followed through, has consequences. And just because a valuation represents a physiological demand for the preservation of a certain way of life doesn't mean that every valuation will actually lead to that preservation of life, right? It might actually lead to its destruction. That values are not created equal, that some will undo themselves, undermine themselves. So Mussolini's amoral relativism doesn't have that meta-ethical orienting principle of will to power. It's just, we have our values, we're going to fight to instate them in the world. Whereas Nietzsche is saying certain values, if instated in the world, will actually over time weaken you, whereas others will actually strengthen you or lead to the enhancement of life, right? And so what he's saying here is that the state will naturally become the receptacle for this struggle for power and for the control of the moral ideas of the majority. And this is particularly true in the democratic era. You could say it can really only be realized as true in the democratic era, where the political order no longer represents this divinely sanctioned hierarchy, this unquestionable distribution of power, but this battleground and contest for the acquisition of power, as a place where that distribution is continually contested with the will of the greatest majority as the driving force. And as the state therefore swells in power, as politics infects every aspect of human life and makes itself synonymous with the people itself. Remember that idea of the state as the corpus, as the body. The entire function, the entire purpose of the state, which is to allow mankind's cultural life to flourish and develop, that's its value to mankind, that ultimately becomes null and void at this point, because at the point when the state begins to smother culture and stifle its further development, when it begins to make all questions settled, when it makes revolution or reform unthinkable, when it begins to restrict artistic expression within certain parameters of acceptability, when it begins to make itself the enemy of culture, right? And so where Hicks is correct in seeing similarities is that Nietzsche is anti-democratic, anti-capitalist, and anti-socialist, but he's also anti-fascist and sees in fascism many commonalities with these other political developments, more than we'd like to realize. And that I think a common thread in all of these that we've seen is that he sees all three of these 20th century approaches to politics as ultimately aligning themselves against culture, against the production of great individuals, against art and individuality as such. All of the pathways that we came up with based on this long line, if I can be a little bit too Karl Popper for a moment, this long line of political idealism going all the way back to Plato, what we came up with were all of these views that still fall victim to that Socratic, Platonic hostility towards art and culture, of just wanting things to be absolutely the same forever, to reach that final state. And fascism is absolutely that way. So I chose the three arrows design to overlay over Nietzsche for this episode because it was the anti-fascist symbol that seemed to fit best. I've been kind of toying around with the different ways of showing Nietzsche in the anti-capitalist camp and anti-communist camp. But the three arrows, the original meaning of this symbol in Germany was for each arrow to be aimed at the three big opponents of the anti-fascists, right? So the fascists, obviously, but also the conservative monarchists and the Marxist-Leninists. Those are the targets of the three arrows. The only one that doesn't quite fit with Nietzsche is like the idea that he would be an anti-monarchist, right? Even that's a little complicated because he basically blamed the dynasties of 19th century Europe for their own troubles, right? He blamed their ostentatious displays of wealth for the rise of socialism. The fact that they let their legitimacy become questionable at all is sort of proof of their own inadequacy, so to speak, right? But nevertheless, we might consider, on the other hand, there's no real monarchists around today. And the same types of people who supported the dynastic interests out of that sentiment of conservatism in those days, if you were to put them in a time machine and bring them here, they would be the capitalist realists and the conservative libertarians of today. That the wing of sort of monarchist conservatives in Germany that the three arrows meant to target in the late 19th century, that role is well filled today by the role of capitalist conservatives. And so in this respect, the three arrows, I think, fits, that Nietzsche rejects fascism, capitalism, and socialism. All are hit by these arrows of his. He rejects all three of the main branches of 20th century political theory. So what remains, right? Well, there are more fringe political theories out there that we could say don't fit, such as like anarchism or anarcho-primitivism. You could even consider Nietzsche's aristocratic radicalism as its own breed of ideology entirely. We could put more emphasis on Nietzsche's untimeliness, his suggestion for his free spirits to seek solitude and retreat from the political life. That's sort of the line that Kaufman takes. the Nietzschean entreaty that the free spirit should be allowed to stand aside of politics, right? Or do we maybe see Nietzsche as a synthesis of multiple theories? Or maybe that Nietzsche is implying some positive claims, perhaps by the via negativa or something like that? I think it's so difficult for us to categorize Nietzsche's thought because his view of history is fatalistic and cyclical. The reason why the state can't be the ends is that the state comes and goes. Nothing lasts forever. And the meaning of our lives, which in Nietzsche's view should be the betterment of mankind, right? Bring forth the overman. That's never served by these momentary political struggles. And so while Nietzsche asserts some of those same brutal truths that might be accepted by the likes of Mussolini, of life as eternal struggle, of war as inevitable and necessary, of hierarchy as this necessary structure of human social life, it's not as if Nietzsche would ever want to create a state that was based on those principles with the idea that it would endure forever, or for that matter, even fulfill the function of the state any better than any form that's already existed, right? The fact that what we value is based on our perspective on who and what we are and cannot be otherwise, that means we cannot view history as this progression towards anything in light of that knowledge. We can't view it as a degeneration from anything. What we perceive instead is this cycle, this circular movement in history in which all returns again and again. And that what Nietzsche believes we should do is accept the cyclical nature of history and accept the inherent fallibility of human governance, just as we accept the inherent frailty of man. But we can still hold the idea of the overman sort of above us, strive to overcome our own limitations. But it's not that the system has to be tinkered with in order to improve mankind. Mankind has to be tinkered with if we ever hope to improve the system by which we live. And so it may be in time that in the course of long generations or in revaluations of values to come, that mankind itself is changed, that we no longer fall victim to these pathologies like revenge and like envy and like all this petty and pointlessly malicious, tendencies in our thought. And when we recognize that it's always people who govern, it's never a piece of paper, it's never an institution in the abstract, it's never the state in the abstract. And so until mankind overcomes all its smallness, we'll only strive in vain to rid our forms of government of that smallness. And that's really, if you have to take away one perspective from this, it's that we're not going to find an ideal form of the state that will solve our problems. The work begins with man himself, right? That's who Nietzsche thinks we chisel away at. And that's why his battle, I think, is cultural rather than political, of reaching out and changing people, working with people as the raw material themselves, right? Rather than the state or the system as the thing that we need to all work on and improve. So with all that in mind, what if we were to jump wholeheartedly into the cyclical view? What if we were to leave all these progressive or degenerative views of history, the Enlightenment thought and Romantic thought and all that? How do we think about the polity from this new perspective? What does politics mean, supposing it can no longer be this idealistic project to perfect the human race, right? Through implementing an ideal system. What would politics be beyond that? We're going to talk about that next week when we dive into a monumental work from outside the traditionally delimited canon of Western philosophy. This is, I think, the first non-Western work we're going to do as the focus of an episode. So this is going to be quite fun for me. I think it's going to be very enlightening to consider this text that we're going to tackle in light of all we've talked about thus far regarding Western political thought and Nietzsche's place within it. So join me next week, where we're going to bring in the work of Ibn Khaldun and his work, the Muqaddimah. That's all, everybody. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.